Welcome to week 8. We're going to talk about the period between 1984 and 1989 first, and then to the end of the century, 1999. So let's get started. Slide 3. The transition from Mao's time to Deng Xiaoping's time was mostly gradual. These changes that we've been studying happened month after month, but it was not as if everything changed overnight. It was in the early 80s that there was gradual economic change, into the late 80s that it became more common throughout society from top to bottom, but people were still pretty poor, in particular peasants and students. I should say urban dwellers and students. Peasants' lives began to pick up, actually, in the mid-1980s as their economic forces were unleashed. But in the cities, private business, like you see in China today, or semi-private business, was not really in existence, and that was even true into the early 90s until 1992. So it was not possible, for example, to go out and have a nice time at night in Beijing because there just wasn't anything out there to have a nice time with. I'm not trying to make any puns. But there were contrasts. The state was no longer sticking its nose into everybody's business about everything. There were no more, there were neighborhood committees that continued to operate, but they were more concerned with actual security matters and things like the one-child policy than they were with making sure everyone was going to their political study meetings, because there weren't that many of them anymore. And the party tended to take a more regulated view or a more regulated approach to solving problems. There was no longer a totalitarian feel to society. There was no longer a state which was intervening in so many parts of everyone's lives. However, the state could not be challenged. The state could not be questioned as far as its authority in society, and that's what led to the crackdown against the democracy wall movement, because people began to question the perfection of the correct Communist Party, as they like to call themselves, the correct Communist Party. They began to question whether or not Mao Zedong was an unassailable figure. And that sort of thing was not allowed then, and is still not allowed now. There were moves by the state to point out that Mao had made errors, but there was no denunciation of Mao, as we'll get into in a few slides hence. There continued to be a priority, as had begun in 1972 with the Nixon visit, of maintaining stable relations with the United States in order to give China time to develop. And there was the occasional political campaign, but not like before, where political campaigns did not punctuate life. They were a constant presence. In the time after Deng Xiaoping came to power, political campaigns were few and relatively far between, although they did continue to exist. Let's go on to slide 4. So some initial changes that occurred was an open discussion of the bad things that had happened in the Cultural Revolution. The reason that this was allowed was that it met a party goal of showing how bad things were before and how they had improved under the present leadership. Not at all unlike the tactic that the communists pursued after 1949 when they first took over. So it was important, in order to show that life was getting better, that people be exonerated from their unfair being sent off to jail for nothing. Persecution, sorry. Their unfair persecutions that they had suffered all those years. And there was criticism of Mao Zedong, certainly, but Deng Xiaoping, in the 1981 resolution on Mao and the Cultural Revolution, orchestrated a criticism of Mao for his policies during the specific period of the Cultural Revolution. And the party named Mao Zedong as being the primary individual responsible for the Cultural Revolution. But Mao as a man was not criticized. There was no attempt to label Mao as a criminal, as Khrushchev had labeled Stalin a criminal. And there was a liberalization going on in Tibet at the same time, which gave Tibetans some hope that the Dalai Lama might eventually return, and gave them some hope that they might actually begin to at least control their own lives, if not the defense and foreign relations of Tibet. However, as we learned last time, the contact that was allowed between the Dharamsala exile government, Dharamsala again being the town in northern India where the Dalai Lama and the exiled government of Tibet are based. There were 4 trips taken to China and Tibet by delegates from Dharamsala, including Galatutin, the older brother of the Dalai Lama. And unfortunately, from the Chinese viewpoint, they discovered, and they were very surprised at how popular these people were amongst Tibetans, and indeed what that represented, that the Dalai Lama retained a great deal of prestige in the Tibetan Autonomous Region and places beyond, ethnographic Tibet beyond the TAR. So problems developed. I'm on slide 5 now. Problems developed in negotiations between the two sides, and as Shakya pointed out, neither side really understood what the other was after, and Shakya actually puts the onus on the Tibetan side for not seeing the opportunity they had, and for holding out for too much. There's a great deal, by the way, as we'll talk about in week 10, there's a great deal of division amongst Tibetans, exiled Tibetans, and some Tibetans inside the TAR about what they should be trying to achieve. There are people who want to achieve full independence. There are people who think they can do that peacefully. There are people who would like to fight a war over it. There are people who want to remain with China and be a part of the motherland, without question. There are people who are at various places in between those two positions. Anyway, in 1984, by 1984, the Chinese side had decided pretty much that they were not going to get anywhere with the Dalai Lama, and they were starting to look at moving toward governance of the TAR without the Dalai Lama's cooperation at all. There had been a hope of a resolution with the Dalai Lama, and the Chinese had considered themselves to be in a position of strength, which they were, but they probably overestimated that position of strength, in particular regarding their own popularity and acceptance amongst the Tibetans themselves. So the work forum, there were 3 of these work forums between 1981 and 1985, or 86, I think it was, the 3rd work forum. And these were meetings of party officials to discuss specific policies to carry forward in the TAR. The TAR, of course, the Tibetan Autonomous Region. there were leftist Tibetans who, if they were in China, if they were Chinese in China, they would be long gone. They would have been discharged years ago. But the reason they hung around, the reason they were allowed to hang around, these were people who had been Cultural Revolution beneficiaries, was that they were amongst the few Tibetans who fully supported the Chinese position in the TAR. Many of them were illiterate individuals. They couldn't read. They did not have what you might call modern office skills. They were not able to actually be functional in a government position. They were mere figureheads. There were people previously, there were people who were able, but they were relatively few in number. The most prominent of them was Fun Wang, who we'll discuss again in a few more slides, and who's been mentioned previously. But the bottom line that the Chinese faced was that they were going to open up Tibet to Chinese people to come there and do business so that they could start to integrate Tibet more closely into China. And they did not trust the Tibetans in any leadership positions in the TAR, although that would eventually change. Because more and more Tibetans, younger people, were coming up through the ranks, having been sent to China for education. Some of them did not read. They could speak, but did not actually read Tibetan. I've met a number of people like that who went to minorities institutes in China to finish college, but did not actually, from about the age of 12, study the Tibetan written language, and so they're 22 years old, they've finished college, and they can't read Tibetan. These are the people who, to be blunt, the Chinese considered to be the models. This is what they wanted. They did not want to continue teaching this non-Sino, non-Chinese language completely out of the Sino language group to a portion of their population. They wanted basically for the Tibetan language to die out except among specialists. They were willing to leave those Tibetans who did not want to be involved in the administration of the new Tibet to themselves, people like the people you see in this picture, but everybody else who wanted to get anywhere in life were expected to conform. Going on to slide 6. What does this mean, this internationalized Tibet issue, or the internationalization of Tibet? This meant that instead of relying on support from India and being careful about who they had contact with, amongst other countries, the Tibetan government, in order to avoid angering the Chinese, the Tibetan government in exile decided to begin to move beyond India and gain help from, if not the governments, then the publics of third countries. Now, why did they do this? Why could they do this? Because previously, the Indian government, not wanting to offend China, their great big neighbor, the Indian government did not allow the Dalai Lama's exiled government to pursue any sort of informal, much less formal relations with third countries or with third country people. They discouraged travel by foreigners to Dharamsala. They did not allow the Dalai Lama to travel internationally, excuse me, except in limited circumstances. So why did they make this decision in 1986-87 to allow it? The reason was it was twofold, really. One was the increasing tensions they had with China, because the Chinese they had a number of border disputes with the Indians, and this was a period when they had decided to push forward and try to get their way in these areas, some of which were highlands overlooking lowland India that they wanted to control, because they wanted to make sure that they had the military advantage on their frontier. That was the bottom line. And the other was that the failure of negotiations between the Dalai Lama and the Chinese, which rested largely on the failure of Hu Yaobang to stay in office, because he was the only communist official who was interested in pursuing a solution with the Dalai Lama, and who had the horsepower, the prestige to carry it through, and the direct connection with Deng Xiaoping. But Deng Xiaoping himself was not really inclined, and there was no one else working under Deng Xiaoping who was inclined to pursue a solution with the Tibetans. And so when Hu Yaobang went away, so did all chances really for a negotiated settlement on the status of Tibet that the Tibetan exiled government would agree to. So since the Indians had started to, they hadn't given up, but between then and now, they have not any longer placed so much emphasis on avoiding the wrath of the Chinese. There has been more of an attitude of resistance to China since the late 1980s, and so they were no longer interested in taking all steps to placate Chinese concerns. They actually began to see the Dalai Lama, as many Indians had previously, as a sort of a weapon, as a sort of an advantage over China. And I think that the Indians probably understood this earlier than most powers did. However, the ease with which China was perturbed whenever the Dalai Lama made an appearance somewhere led other Western governments to begin to see that all they had to do, if you'll pardon me, all they had to do to twist the dragon's tail was to have lunch with the Dalai Lama. Why, they knew they had that card in their back pocket, and they played it. And one reason why they played it, as we discussed previously, was that in the public, amongst the voting publics in the West, in Western Europe, and the United States, and Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand, especially, the Dalai Lama was growing more popular, as you can see in this photograph of the young Richard Gere, who has not yet been in the movie. What was that movie called? He was in a movie where he fell in love with a prostitute and showed her how much he loved her by showering her with gifts, whatever it was called. That was the time when he made that movie. A couple years after that. Anyway, it was during this time when activism in Western publics on behalf of Tibet began, and it pretty much got started by Richard Gere, who was a Buddhist and who was partly doing all of this for religious reasons. Let's go on to slide 7. So in 1987, when the Dalai Lama was in the United States and was getting ready to make a speech before Congress, talk about twisting the dragon's tail, people in Tibet knew this, and there were already some problems related to the regulation of monks and monasteries that were irking people, and some demonstrations began. And the Chinese came down hard on them. Before 2 days had gone by, shots had been fired into a crowd of monks. And this led to not a general uprising, really, but 2 or 3 days of intense rioting, where Tibetans attacked Chinese people, where they attacked Chinese storefronts, as happened in March of 19 rather 2008, and the two sides basically terrorized each other in Lhasa. And there were other things that happened in other parts of Tibet too, but because there were fewer foreigners around in those places to observe them, it's rather difficult to keep track of what actually did happen. But subsequent conflicts over the next few years deepened the divide between Tibetans on one side and the CCP and Chinese migrants on the other. There was increasing distrust. It was a time when there were very few friendships, and indeed it's not very much different today. Very few friendships between Chinese and Tibetan people in the places where there's a lot of tension, like Lhasa. That's not to say that relations aren't better in other places. I've traveled through Tibet a bit, and I know that in the countryside where people are there's a little bit less of tension between populations. There tend to be more even relations between Chinese and Tibetans, but it's a very uneven and complicated picture that I don't think I can fairly characterize. So during this period, the bottom line is that the resignation that was felt by many people on the Tibetan side, that there's really nothing we can do, we're going to have to live with these Chinese, began to be replaced, at least among some, especially monks and nuns, with a simmering anger that has not improved over the last 2 decades. We'll stop this audio here and go on to slide 8.